Hello, welcome back to A People's Historian. Welcome to downtown Sassoon, almost. We're across the marina, actually, but I wanted to do an on-location video in Sassoon because there's an indigenous tribe that actually lives here, called the Sassoons. This town was named after the Sassoon Bay, which was named after the Indian tribe Sassoons. The town was founded in the 1850s. This marina here was a bustling metropolis. This was the major city in this area. For the main product here was selling grain, and they were shipping grain out of this marina, up the slough into the Sacramento River, going to Sacramento and San Francisco, and of course supplies were coming in as well. This was the busiest city in the area, and General Vallejo actually came here to form a buffer zone between the Russians that were over at Fort Ross, which is about 10 miles away from a little town called Jenner on the coast, and the Spanish over here. Had some scuffles with the indigenous peoples. The Sassoons defeated them, but became friends with Chief Solano. They were friends. He was actually somewhat of a benevolent leader. So, I mean, and that's what the town of Vallejo is named after, General Vallejo, and the town of Benicia is named after his wife. That's one of her middle names. We covered that in an episode. So, if you like what you're hearing, hit the like and subscribe button, and let's dig into Chapter 9 of An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Chapter starts off with two quotations. There is one feature in the expansion of the peoples of white or European blood during the past 4 centuries which should never be lost sight of, especially by those who denounce such expansion on moral grounds. On the whole, the movement has been fraught with lasting benefit to most of the peoples already dwelling in the lands over which the expansion took place. Theodore Roosevelt, The Expansion of the White Races, 1909. Second quotation. And the trademark they had in Black Hills, they had carved George Washington, them others there. Them people didn't own that piece of land, but they made some carving over there. Anybody could realize you have to go to Washington, Europe, and carve my face over there. Henry Crow, Dog. Although U.S. imperialism abroad might seem at first to fall outside the scope of this book, it's important to recognize that the same methods and strategies that were employed with the indigenous peoples on the continent were mirrored abroad. While the indigenous Americans were being brutally colonized, eliminated, relocated, and killed, the United States from its beginning was also pursuing overseas dominance. Between 1798 and 1827, that's about 22 years after the period starts, 22 years after the start of the founding of this country, the independence of this country, the United States intervened militarily 23 times, from Cuba to Tripoli to Greece. Tripoli is Libya, by the way. There were 71 overseas interventions between 1831 and 1896 on all continents, and the United States dominated most of Latin America economically, some countries militarily. The 40 interventions and occupations between 1898 and 1919, a period of 21 years, 40 interventions, were conducted with even more military heft, but using the same methods and sometimes the same personnel. Connections. U.S. colonies established during 1898 to 1919 include Hawaii, formerly called the Sandwich Islands, Alaska, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, the Marshall Islands, and Northern Mariana. Most of these, and dozens more islands depopulated in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the Caribbean for military bases and bomb testing, remain colonies, called territories and commonwealths in the 21st century. One of the first outspoken proponents of transoceanic imperialism was former abolitionist William H. Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State and who considered it the destiny of the United States to dominate the Pacific. Seward did everything possible to fulfill that perceived destiny, including arranging the purchase of Alaska in 1867. In early 1874, the United States began military control of Hawaii, and in 1898 it annexed the islands after overthrowing the Hawaiian queen Liliuokalani. Following post-World War II ascendancy to statehood, indigenous Hawaiians and Alaskan natives were brought under similar U.S. colonial rule as Native Americans. Overseas ventures gained increasingly exuberant public support in the late 19th century. In the best-selling book Our Country, 1885, the Reverend Josiah Strong of the American Home Missionary Society argued that the United States had inherited the mantle of Anglo-Saxonism and, as a superior race, had a divine responsibility to control the world. By 1914, there were 6,000 U.S. Protestant missionaries in China and thousands of others in every other part of the non-European world. And they remained, as from the early 17th century, ensconced in Native American communities. The United States built the naval Great White Fleet and expanded the army from 25,000 to nearly 300,000 men by the time it invaded and occupied Cuba, undermining the ongoing independence movement against Spain there. While U.S. troops were headed to Havana Harbor in 1898, Admiral George Dewey led the U.S. Navy to intervene in the Philippines, purportedly to assist a force of 30,000 indigenous Filipino rebels who had won and declared their independence from Spain. Dewey referred to the Filipinos as the Indians and vowed to enter the city of Manila and keep the Indians out. It took the United States 3 more years to crush the Filipino Indian resistance to U.S. occupation. Indian resistance. Oh, you can't see my air quotes over there. Indian resistance. The Army, using counterinsurgency techniques practiced against the indigenous nations of the North American continent, including new forms of torture, such as waterboarding, and under many of the same Army commanders. 26 of the 30 U.S. generals in the Philippines had been officers in the Indian Wars. Major General Nelson A. Miles, who had commanded the Army in campaigns against indigenous peoples, was put in general command of the Army in the Philippines War. The continuity between invading and occupying sovereign indigenous nations in order to achieve continental control in North America and employing the same tactics overseas to achieve global control is key to understanding the future of the United States in the world. The military provided that continuity. As a colonel in the 1870s, Nelson Miles had been in charge of pursuing every last Sioux and herding them onto reservations guarded by troops or recently trained Indian police. The reservations were not safe havens for the incarcerated. Struck by the told of multiple horrors of daily life of the Yankton Sioux Reservation, which was not out of the ordinary. Another time when General Sully came up, he passed through the middle of our field, turned all his cattle and stock into our corn, and destroyed the whole of it. The soldiers set fire to the prairie and burnt up 4 of our lodges and all there was in them. The soldiers are very drunken and come to our place. They have arms and guns. They run after our women and fire into our houses and lodges. One soldier came along and wanted one of our young men to drink, but he would not, and turned to go away, and the soldiers shot at him. Before the soldiers came along, we had good health. But once the soldiers come along, they go to my squaws and want to sleep with them. And the squaws, being hungry, will sleep with them in order to get something to eat, and will get a bad disease, and then the squaws turn to their husbands and give them the bad disease. Oh, my stomach is turning reading this. I'm laughing at the train going by the way. As related in Chapter 8, Miles had also led the Army's pursuit of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce as they sought to escape to Canada. And in 1886, Miles took charge of the War Department's efforts to capture Geronimo, commanding 5,000 soldiers, a third of the Army's combat force, along with 500 Apache scouts forced into service and thousands of volunteer settler militiamen. In 1898, now General-in-Chief of the Army, Miles personally commanded the U.S. forces that seized Puerto Rico. Miles's second-in-command, General Wesley E. Merritt, was assigned to head the military invasion of the Philippines. He had served under Custer fighting Sioux and Cheyenne resistance. Commanding the Army occupation of the Philippines was General Henry W. Lawton, to whom Geronimo had turned himself in, making Lawton an instant hero for capturing Geronimo. Lawton had led troops in Cuba before going to the Philippines. Ironically, Philippine insurgents under the leadership of a man named Geronimo killed Lawton in an attack. Well, that is ironic. What these U.S. officers had learned in counterinsurgency warfare in North America, they applied against the Filipinos. Younger officers would apply lessons learned in the Philippines to future imperial ventures, or in at least one case pass them to a son. General Arthur MacArthur, father of World War II General Douglas MacArthur, chased Filipino guerrilla leader Emilio Aguinaldo, finally capturing him. By this time, Theodore Roosevelt was president. His corporate-friendly militarism, that's right, corporate-friendly militarism, particularly his rapid development of the Navy and his carefully staged performance as leader of the Rough Riders militia in Cuba, brought him to the presidency. He was popular with both settlers and big business. Roosevelt referred to Aguinaldo as a renegade Pawnee and observed that Filipinos did not have the right to govern their country just because they happened to occupy it. Wow, I gotta read that one again. Gotta be an American to say something like that. Roosevelt referred to Aguinaldo as a renegade Pawnee and observed that Filipinos did not have the right to govern their country just because they happened to occupy it. Now I feel like I gotta apologize to Filipinos. 200,000 U.S. soldiers fought in the Philippines, suffering 7,000 casualties, 3.5%. 20% of the Philippine population died, 20%, mostly civilians, as a result of the U.S. Army's scorched earth strategy, food deprivation, targeting civilians for killing, and so on, and displacement. In 1904, Roosevelt pronounced what has come to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It mandated that any nation engaged in chronic wrongdoing, that is, did anything to threaten perceived U.S. economic or political interests, would be disciplined militarily by the United States, which was to serve as an international police power. At least he's stating the truth. That's how our government is now, and they won't say that. As the U.S. economy rapidly industrialized, the Army also intervened frequently on the side of big business in domestic conflicts between corporations and workers. Troops were used for this purpose in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the first nationwide work stoppage, begun by railroad workers protesting wage cuts. Begun in West Virginia, the strike soon spread along rail lines from ocean to ocean and from north to south. General Philip Sheridan and his troops, and we've mentioned that guy, were called in from the Great Plains, where they had been campaigning against the Sioux, to halt the strike in Chicago. Industrialization affected farming as machinery replaced farmers' hands and cash crops came to prevail. Large operators moved in and banks foreclosed on small farmers, leaving them landless. Farmers' movements, most of them socialist-leaning and anti-imperialist, opposed military conscription and U.S. entry into World War I, the rich man's war as they called it. Tens of thousands protested and carried out acts of civil disobedience. In August 1917, white, black, and Muskogee tenant farmers and sharecroppers in several eastern and southern Oklahoma counties took up arms to stop conscription, with the larger stated goal of overthrowing the U.S. government to establish a socialist commonwealth. Maybe I should find a book on that particular period. That sounds dramatic and interesting. These more radically minded grassroots socialists had organized their own working class union with Anglo-American, African-American, and indigenous Muskogee farmers forming a kind of rainbow alliance. Their plan was to march to Washington, D.C., motivating millions of working people to arm themselves and to join them along the way. After a day of dynamiting oil pipelines and bridges in southeastern Oklahoma, whoa, dynamiting oil pipelines and bridges, the men and their families created a liberated zone where they ate, sang hymns, and rested. By the following day, heavily armed posses, supported by police and militias, stopped the revolt, which became known as the Green Corn Rebellion. Those who didn't get away were arrested and received prison sentences. The rebellion is today considered as the waning voice of the people pushed off the land, but it also reflects the crisis induced by the forced allotment of indigenous territories and the reality of a multi-ethnic resistance movement, a rare occurrence in U.S. colonialist history. At the same time, landless indigenous farmers were launching a revolution in Mexico. Before President Wilson put General John J. Pershing at the head of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe in 1917, the president had sent him to lead troops, mainly Buffalo soldiers, inside Mexico for nearly a year to stop the revolution in the north led by Francisco Pancho Villa. The military intervention did not go well. Even the Mexican federal troops fighting Villa resented the presence of U.S. soldiers. About the only notable success for the U.S. military expedition was the killing of Villa's second-in-command by a young lieutenant named George Patton. Let's close the episode there. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the scenery of the beautiful Sassoon Marina behind me. And hit the like and subscribe button. We'll see you in the next episode.